This video is going to look at how we can create case nodes in NVivo and how we can use them within the wider project. So I've returned to this interview with Charles, and I'm going to create Charles as a case node, and this will enable us to do a whole range of advanced functionality later on in the line of our research. So Charles is our participant, and essentially by creating him as a case node, it's almost like creating him as a theme. So I'm going to go for the first statement that Charles has said, right click on it, code this selection at a new node, and I'm just going to call it Charles. If you recall, you can go to your nodes, and while it's still open, you can use this layout for rapid coding. So I'm just going to highlight everything Charles has said and code it at Charles. As this is a short interview, it shouldn't take too long. This should be enough just to demonstrate what this looks like. So if I head to my nodes, drag this down so you can still see, you'll see I've got Charles as a theme here, and if I double click on it, it should just contain all of the words that Charles have said. Now this is useful because later on, instead of searching for Charles's interview, I can instead search for Charles, the case node, and it will just search the text that he has said, and it won't be confused with anything that the researcher has said in questioning. Now, to actually make this a case node, I need to really apply some metadata to it. Now, for that to happen, I need to tell NVivo that Charles is a person and assign some attributes to it. But at the moment, NVivo doesn't know that people exist. So to start that off with, I need to head to classifications, node classifications, and then I can right click here and go for a new classification. You'll see there are organisation and person as predefined cases, but I'm going to create a new one to show you how this works. So I'm just going to call this person. Now that that has happened, I could, if I want to, head to my nodes, right click on Charles, and classify him as a person. However, it's more useful when we're including some additional data alongside that. So I'm going to return to my classifications, and while I've got the person node classification selected, I'm going to right click and go for new attribute. Now there's a whole range of different data that I could associate with this. The first example I'm going to give is gender. So I'm going to type gender here, and as there are a limited number of values for this, I can actually click on values and insert them. So in this case, my participant could be male, they could be female, and I'm going to put other in here because they might not identify with either gender. If I click OK, you'll see that attribute will load under this particular classification, and I can now assign a gender to any of my participants. I'm going to right click on here again and go for another new attribute. This time I'm going to leave it as an open response, so I could put company. This time I can type in an answer as to which company a participant works in, and so I'm not going to specify any potential answers and just click OK. One last example, right click here again and new attribute. You'll see so far I've been using text, but I do have the option to do a whole range of different input types. For this case, we're just going to need text again. This time, as I'm doing a comparative study, I'm going to be looking at the difference between employers and managers. I'm just going to put the attribute of status, click on the values, click add, and then I'm going to add those two types. So they could be a manager or they could be an employee. And then click OK. Now that I've done that, you'll notice I could go back into my nodes, I can right click on Charles, and this time when I go to node properties, attribute values, I can start assigning these. So I could go in here and say Charles is male, Charles works for company X, and I could say his status is a manager and click OK. Now every single piece of text in here, so essentially everything that Charles has said, now has that information associated with it. NVivo knows that these words have been said by a male manager who works for company X, and this can be very powerful as we can use this when we're refining searches later on in the research process. For this to work, however, it's really important to make sure that each of your participants have a node and that every time they have said something, you assign that text to it. Now this can get quite confusing because we have both thematic nodes and case nodes in the same folder. As an element of good practice, I would always recommend putting your themes directly within the nodes folder. For any case nodes, you can right click here and you can create new folders. So I could create a folder called, for example, case nodes, but as I've only got people in this project, I'm just going to call it people. Click OK, and you'll see my people folder is loaded over the side here. I'm going to drag Charles over into this one. Now, this doesn't look particularly powerful in a project with few participants, but if I return to environmental change down east and go into the nodes, places and people, and open up interview participants, you can see this researcher has a whole range of different people. Now, when I've got a project of this size, I can actually browse all the attribute information in a single view. To do that, if I click on Explore, then click on Node Classification Sheets, it will list all the available node classifications. In this case, I'm interested in person, so I click on person, and it will open up a single sheet with all the information about the interview participants, and in this case, the survey participants as well. I can use this dialog, as you can see, to edit any of this information or input it in the first place, and this gives us one single view of all the information about our participants. Case nodes are incredibly powerful, particularly for those refined searches later on while we're querying, but hopefully this gives you a really good overview of how and why you should use case nodes within NVivo.